Chapter 13 of The Adventures of Joel Pepper. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to find out how you can volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Elijah. Chapter 13 of The Adventures of Joel Pepper by Margaret Sidney. Chapter 13. Passengers for the Boxford Stage. "I declare that's fine," said Ben the next day. It was dull and cloudy, and he squinted up at the sky. "There isn't a bit of wind. Now Mr. Blodgett'll have that bonnet. I guess that'll suit you, Joe, as you can't have much fun with that hand." Joel squealed right out. "That's prime, and I can pile in the sticks and straw just as well with my other hand." "You aren't going to touch that bonfire once it's lighted," declared Ben in his most decided way. "Now you remember that, Joel Pepper." "There ain't any good in it if I can help it," cried Joel, horribly disappointed. "You can see it," said Ben, "same's David." "Oh, what's that?" cried Joel. "That won't be any fun." "Then you can stay at home," said Ben, coolly. "As for having you carrying around that fire and cutting up your capers, we ain't going to let you. Like enough, you'd be half burnt up." "Whew!" cried Joel, in high disdain, snapping the fingers of his well hand. "I wouldn't get a fire." "I wouldn't trust you. You'd be afire before you knew it. You needn't tease, Joe. Mamsie wouldn't allow it." And Ben walked off and shut the door. "Ben never lets me do anything," howled Joel, twisting his face up into a dreadful knot, and wishing there was something he could do with his left hand, for the other was all tied up in a sling. Mother Pepper wisely concluded that it to be the only way to keep it still. "If I tie it up, Joel, you can't use it," she had said, fastening the broad strip of white cloth firmly over his shoulder. And Joel, knowing there was no use in protesting, had borne it as well as he could, making David wait on him, and driving Polly almost to despair in her efforts to amuse him, while she did up the morning walk, Mother Pepper being away. "Why won't you play in stagecoach, Joel?" prosed Polly now, as Joel couldn't vent his disappointment loudly enough. "That's no fun with one hand," said Joel, discontentedly, drumming on the window pane. "Some folks always drive with their left hand." "Or their hand," said Polly. "Mr. Tisbett doesn't," said Joel, gloomily regarding the bunch of white cloth that covered his right hand. "He always drives with this one," sticking it out, "'cept when he takes both." "Well, you can play there's been an accident, and you got hurt, and so you had to drive with one hand," said Polly. "So I can," cried Joel, bounding away from the window. "So I can, Polly Pepper, and I'll have it right now, and it's to be a perfectly awful one. Come on, Davie, let's fix up the coach, and do you get inside, and I'll upset you, and most smash everything to death." And Joel ran hither and thither, dragging the chairs, and Phronsie's little cricket, and everything immovable into place as well as he could with one hand. "Take care, Joe," warned Polly, wondering if she hadn't done wrong in protesting stagecoach. "Don't fly round so you'll hurt your hand. Get up on the front seat if I were you, and begin to drive." "Would you have the horses run into something, Polly, kersmash?" cried Joel, tugging at Mamsie's rocking chair to bring it into line. "Or make the stagecoach tumble over and roll downhill?" "Dear me!" cried Polly, going into the pantry to mix up her brown bread, and wondering which would be the less of the two evils. "I'm sure I don't know, Joel." "I'm going to have 'em do both," decided Joel. "Davie, pull this up, will you? So little David ran and gave a lift on the other side of the big rocking chair to haul it into place. "We'll run into something, and the horse'll shy, and that'll make the old stagecoach roll downhill. Gee whickets!" He up in huge delight. "I shan't let you play at all," said Polly from the pantry. "If you say such words, Joel, you'll just have to stop and go and sit down. So remember." Joel was clambering up into Mr. Tisbett's seat on the box, but he ducked his head at Polly's rebuke. "Get in, Dave," he shouted, recovering himself. "Hurry up, you're the passenger that wants to go to Boxford. There, you're awful slow. I'll drive off without you if you don't make haste," he threatened, gathering up in his left hand the bits of string that were fastened to a nail in the corner of the shelf. Little David, feeling it a dreadful calamity to be left behind when he wanted to go to Boxford, hopped nimbly into the opening in the pile of chairs that represented the old stagecoach, and off they drove. "Can't hold my whip," cried Joel in distress, after a minute or so of bowling along the road to Boxford. Accompanied with much shouting to Mr. Tisbett's pair of black horses, and excitement generally as the stage driver tried to get out of the way of the great number of teams on the turnpike. "Oh, dear, it ain't any fun without the whip," and the whole establishment came to a dead stop. "I'll hold the whip," cried the passenger, eagerly poking his head out of the white stagecoach window. "No, you won't either," said Joel. "You're the passenger." "Oh, dear, they ain't fun without the whip." "Then I can drive," said little David. "Do let me, Joel," he pleaded. "I won't either," declared Joel, flatly. "I'm Mr. Tisbett, and besides, there won't be anybody inside if you get up here." "Phronsie might be passenger," said Joel, reflecting a moment. "Goody, oh, so she might!" cried Joel, "and Seraphina, too, and that'll make more upset. Then you may come up here, Dave," he promised. But when Polly was made acquainted with this fine plan, she refused to allow Phronsie to enter into such a noisy play, and Joel's face dropped so dismally that she was at her wits' end to know how to straighten out the trouble. Just then one of the Henderson boys came up to the door with a little pat of butter in a dish for Mrs. Pepper. "Here comes Peletiah Henderson," announced Polly, catching sight of him through the window. "Perhaps he can stop and play with you, Joel." "He ain't much good to play," answered Joel, who never seemed to be able to wake up the quiet boy to such action. "Oh, Joel, he'll play real pretty, I guess," said Polly, reprovingly, "and he's such a good boy." "He might be the passenger," said Joel, thinking busily, as Polly ran to the door to let the Henderson boy in. "We'll play he's the minister goin' over to preach in Boxford, and we'll upset him just before he gets there. Jump out, Dave, and get up here." "I don't know as we ought to upset him if he's the minister," objected David, doubtfully, as he clambered up to Joel's side. Still, a perfect thrill of delight seized him at his promotion to the seat of honor, and his little hands trembled as Joel laid the precious whip within them. "No, I guess I'd rather you had the reins," decided Joel, twitching away the whip to lay the bits of string in David's little brown hands. "You can drive first, 'cause I want to crack the whip awful loud as we start, and then I'll take him again." David, who would much rather have whip, said nothing, feeling it bliss enough to be up there on the box and doing something, as Peletiah, a light-haired boy, serious boy, walked slowly into the kitchen. "You're the passenger," shouted Joel at him, and cracking his whip. "And you're going over to Boxford. Hurry up and get in the stagecoach. I'm Mr. Tisbett." "And I'm helping, Peletiah," cried David, turning a very pink and happy face down toward him. "I don't want to go to Boxford," said Peletiah, derisively, and standing quite still, while Polly ran to the pantry to slip the little pat of butter onto another plat. "Oh, how good it looks!" she said, longing for just one taste. "Well, you got to go," said Joel, obstinately, "so you'd better get in." "But I don't want to go to Boxford," repeated Peletiah, not stirring. Joel cracked the whip angrily and glared down at him. "Perhaps he wants to go somewhere else," said little David, leaning forward and clutching the reins carefully, "and that'll be just as good." "Do you," asked Joel, crossly, "want to go anywhere else, Peletiah?" Peletiah considered so long over this that Joel, drumming with his heels on the dashboard, got tired out, and shouted, "Hurry up and get in, the stagecoach is going," which had the desired effect to make the passenger trip in much livelier than he intended. "Now we're going to Boxford," announced Joel, positively, cracking his whip at its loudest. "Be careful, David. Hold the horses up." "He said he didn't want to go to Boxford," put in little David, trembling all over at the vast responsibility of holding in Mr. Tisbett's black horses and the passengers being taken where he didn't want to go. "Well, he didn't tell us where he wanted to go," said Joel, "and the stagecoach is going to Boxford." "Boxford! He screamed to imaginary people along the road. "Anybody want to go to Boxford?" "I said I didn't want to go to Boxford," interrupted the passenger in general din. "Well, you got to go," said Joel, "'cause the stagecoach is going there. Boxford! Anybody going to Boxford? Want to go to Marm?" As imaginary old woman sitting on a stone by the roadside. "I'm going to get out," announced Peletiah, in a tone that convinced Joel that the remonstrance was useless. "No, you mustn't," cried Joel. "And you can't either, for the accident's coming now," he added cheerfully. Davie held his breath and clutched the lines tighter yet, and Joel screamed shrilly, "Look out!" and gave an awful kick with his heels to the back of the top chair, and before anybody could say a word, over it came, knocking Davie with it, and before the passenger could get out, Mr. Tisbett and his assistant, and the best part of all, the whole establishment, seemed to be on top of him. Polly heard the noise and came rushing out. "Oh, boys!" she cried in affright. "Are you hurt?" For everything seemed to be in a heap together, with some small legs kicking wildly about, trying to extract the persons to whom they belonged. "I ain't," announced Joel, hopping out of heaps and shaking the black hair out of his eyes. "Oh, Polly, it was such fun!" he cried. "Davie and Peletiah!" she cried, an awful dread at her heart on account of the little guest, as she hung over the wreck, pulling busily at the chairs. "Are you all safe?" Little David tried to speak, but his head ached dreadfully, and the breath seemed to have left his body. Peletiah said slowly, "I barked my shin. He didn't want to go to Boxford." "Oh, dear me!" exclaimed Polly, fishing him out. "That's too bad. Joel, you ought to have taken him to Boxford if he didn't want to go." "That wouldn't have made a difference," declared Joel, "'cause we had to get upset anyway." "Well, Davie's hurt, I accept," said Polly, looking Peletiah carefully all over, as in duty bound to a guest as he stood up before her. "Oh, no, I ain't, Polly," said little David, trying to speak cheerfully, and crawling out with a big lump on his forehead. "Oh, dear me!" exclaimed Polly at the sight of it. "Well, I'm glad, child, it's no worse," as she rapidly examined the rest of him. "Now, you must go and get some pieces of wet brown paper on that." "I'm glad I didn't have to get wet brown paper all over me," declared Joel with a grimace. "Old slippery, shiny brown paper." "I brought my shin," gravely announced Peletiah, standing quite still. "Oh, so you did," cried Polly, with a remorseful twinge. "Now, you must wait, Davie, till I fix Peletiah up, for he's company, you know." Grandma's got some wormwood, the stuff she made for Phronsie his toe when 'twas pounded," suggested Joel, quite oblivious to the black looks which Peletiah was constantly casting on him. "You may run over and see," said Polly. "O dear me, no, you can't, Joel. Just look at your hand," as she happened to glance up. Joel looked down quickly at the big white bundle in the sling. "There ain't nothin'," he was going to say, "the matter with my hand, Polly," when he saw some very red spots spreading quickly along its surface. "Oh, now you'll burst the cut open," cried Polly, forgetting herself and turning quite white. "What shall we do? And Mamsie away." Little David at that burst into a loud cry, and Joel tried to say, "No, I haven't," but looking very scared at Polly's scream. "Oh, I'll fix it, Joe," she exclaimed in haste, though how she managed to get the words out, she never knew. "Let me see, Mamsie would untie it if she were here, and put on court plaster. Now, David, you run over to Grandma's and ask her to give us some more. She told us to come if we want it, and I'll put on a fresh piece just as tight. Oh, you can't think." Polly kept talking all the time, feeling that she should drop if she didn't, and little David, forgetting all about the lump on his forehead, now that was the most as big as an egg, ran off as fast as he could, and presently returned with the court plaster that Polly so needed, waving it over his head. Polly took off the bloody rag, setting her lips tightly together until she saw Joel's face again. Then she began quickly, "Oh, what a nice time you're going to have at that bonfire, Joe." "Is there going to be a bonfire?" asked Peletiah, with more interest than he had hitherto shown. "Yes," said Polly, "there is, Peletiah. Mr. Blodgett's going to burn up all that rubbish left after he pulled down his cow pen, you know." "Where's he going to burn it?" continued Peletiah. "This afternoon," said Polly. "Ben's over there, and Joel's going, and David." And all the while she was dabbing off the blood running down out of the side where the court plaster slipped with the stage went over. Then she cut off another bit from the piece that Grandma Bascom sent over, and quickly pasted it over the edge of the old piece. "There now, Joey," she cried, "that's as nice as it can be. Now I'll get you a fresh piece of old cloth to tie it up in." "Well, I don't want it tied up," cried Joel, wiggling his fingers. "They feel so good to be out, Polly." "Oh, you must have 'em tied up," cried Polly, deceitfully, running back with the cloth. "Hold your hand still, Joe. Now, there now, says I. That's all done." She gave a great sigh of relief when at last Joel's arm was once more in its sling. "I'm glad it's all back again, Polly," said little David, viewing the white bundle with satisfaction. "So am I declare," said Polly, folding her hands to rest a bit. "I guess I'll have to go to that bonfire," observed Peletiah at the sound of his voice. Polly came to herself with a little gasp. "Oh, I forgot all about you, Peletiah, and David's head. I'll see your shin first, 'cause you're company." When Peletiah's small trouser leg was pulled up, Polly saw with dismay a black and blue spot rapidly spreading. "Oh, dear me!" she cried, down on her knees. "What will dear Mrs. Henderson say? And she's so good to us." "And I didn't want to go to Boxford either," said Peletiah. "Well, David, you must just run back and ask Grandma if we shall have little wormwood," said Polly. "I'd go, but I don't like to leave you children alone." In distress, as she saw David's lump on his forehead and his hot, tired face, "I'm sorry, for you've just been over there." "I'll go," cried Joel, springing off, but Polly called him back. "No, you can't, Joe," she cried. "You'll burst that cut open again. Maybe Davie must go. Tell Grandma one of the minister's boys has got hurt." So Davie ran over again, trying not to think how his head ached, and in he came in a few minutes with the bunch of wormwood dangling at his side. She said Grandma did pound it up and tie it on with a rag. "If you haven't got time to steep it," said Davie, relinquishing the bundle into Polly's hand. "And to put some on my head, too," he added, feeling this to be a calamity as much worse as could be imagined than to have on the brown paper bits. "So I will," declared Polly. "Oh, how good of Grandma, boys. We must ever do and all we can for her. She's so nice to us. Now I must pound this up, just as she said." This operation was somewhat delayed by all three of the boys hanging over her and getting in the way, and Phronsie, who had been busy with Seraphina in the bedroom, now running out to add herself to the number. It was a little time before Peletiah's small leg had the wet rag tied on. "Well, now you're done," said Polly, thankfully. "And you had better run home, Peletiah, and tell your mother all about it and how sorry we are." "Yes," said Peletiah, slowly moving off, "I will, 'cause she told me to come right." "Oh, Peletiah!" exclaimed Polly, in honor. "And you've been here all this time." "And I didn't want to go to Boxford," said Peletiah, going off. Pretty soon back he came, just as Polly finished bathing Davie's head. "I'll take the dish," he said. "Mother said bring it back." End of chapter 13. Read by Elijah Fisher.